What's going on, guys? So today I'm going to be doing a review of one of my favorite games, Resident Evil 4. I've played this game pretty much countless times, and I've come to find it's one of my favorites. But how good is this game? Does it compare to its counterparts of the franchise? Is it an action game, a horror game, some combination of those things? And how should it be rated compared to the other games of its franchise? That is kind of the idea of the review we're going to be doing today. So I think to kind of get a ground base for what the game is, let's talk about some of the positive aspects of Resident Evil 4. Because a lot of people, a lot of classic fans, people who are really nostalgic for this franchise, people who played maybe the original games, don't really care as much for some of the later installments. So let's talk about some of the things it did well, and then we'll get into some of the criticisms of the game, and we'll see how we feel about it overall. So things it did well. Gameplay wise, this game is pretty solid. There's not really that many bad mechanics in the game. The aiming is really great. The combat system is really fun. You can just have the basic point and shoot, which is kind of fun. The laser pointer system is kind of nice. You have you can set up melees if that's what you want, or if you would like a real challenge, you can go through the whole game with just a knife. Well, maybe not the whole thing, but most of the game with just a knife, which is pretty crazy. The inventory system has its pros and cons. On the one hand, if you enjoy it, it's kind of Tetris-like, which is kind of like a mini game in and of itself every time you want to organize the inventory. However, you could argue that is a bit tedious. It's also nice because you also kind of get an RPG feeling when you upgrade the items. So right off the bat, you see a lot of things in this game that are a lot different from its predecessors. Kind of you could combine stuff in the previous installments to get kind of stronger ammo for your weapons or whatever, but it has a lot stronger of a presence in this game as opposed to a lot of the previous installments, which is not a bad thing in my opinion. I really like the RPG system. It's just very different. So it also has a very creepy atmosphere. You arrive, you immediately encounter these zombie-like things, and we'll get into the fact that they're not zombies a little bit later. But you encounter some of these zombie-like things. They are somewhat intimidating, threatening. That you're in kind of a dark, spooky, foggy forest. You go through some town full of these crazy things. Later it rains, you get into the big spooky castle, then you get onto the island, and you're kind of trapped on there. Each area feels really uniquely designed. Like the thing about Resident Evil 4 is it is a very long game, but that is much more tolerable due to the fact that none of these areas really feel all that redundant. When you play through the game, each area feels unique to its own, and there are even sub-areas within the areas that feel very different. For example, the exterior of the castle does not look like once you get deep inside the castle. The two look almost nothing alike. So that is a really cool thing about this game as well. Now, in terms of whether this game is scary, because it is supposed to be a survival horror title, it's really not. I mean, scary, I guess, is dependent on your own personal experience with horror games. I mean, I'm sure some people, they look at the scariest movie out there and they probably don't even think that is that scary, but some people probably look at a movie that's not that scary and they think it's terrifying. So it all depends on your tolerance level to some degree. Now, in my opinion, this game does have a few parts that really stand out as being more horror specific. The first one being the chainsaw guy. When you first encounter him, he's kind of a big deal. You don't know where the shotgun is, where nothing is. You've got all these zombies around you, and there's this one dude with a chainsaw, and he just keeps hacking through all the doors. He's coming after you. You're firing round after round into him, and he just won't drop. Pretty intimidating guy, and you encounter him a few more times throughout the game. And then, of course, in the mercenary mode, you have the man with the double chainsaw, which is also even more intimidating. Now, a few other parts. The Thing, when you go through the area with the cages, is also very scary. It feels like you're kind of a rat, trapped in a little bit of a maze, which is also a really, really scary part of that game, because it definitely gets your heart pounding trying to get through that area in the time, especially if you don't know where you're going. A lot of people will play a game a billion times, and then that kind of loses its sense of horror or scare. But that does exist. And the other part I would denote is when you fight Salazar's right hand. because that thing pops out of nowhere so many times. There's a pattern to it, of course, once you play the game enough, but when you're going through it the first few times, he's popping out of nowhere. Harder difficulties, he's one-shotting you. So that's definitely some crazy stuff. Now, the story is not complicated, but I think you can make that argument about a lot of these games, is that they're not that complicated. This action is also very fun. Whether you want action in a Resident Evil game or not, the action that does exist, it's pretty fun. It's a basic story. She's a damsel in distress. Leon is sent to save her. It's the president's daughter. Blah, 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 all that type of stuff. But that is kind of the basis for an idea of it being more of an action game. And this is something you could compare and contrast to earlier titles in the franchise, because when you look at, for example, the first game, that game is pretty much just about surviving. Yes, they go there to rescue Bravo Team, but Bravo Team's pretty much already, they're pretty much already wiped out by the time they get there. So, more or less. I mean, you still got a few dudes, but they're more or less wiped out by the time they get there. And the whole thing was initially set up for them by Wesker to actually be a test of all those bioweapons to see if they could survive. So that's really the thing, is that game is really about survival. You're trapped in this house. You're forced to go through it, to all these different rooms, just scrounging up whatever you can to survive. This game is not like that. This game has a clear-cut purpose: rescue the president's daughter and escape the evil, Ganados, I guess, or Las Plagas, or they have another name for their cult, but I can't remember right now. But yeah, it's pretty. And that's the difference, is this feels like an action story, like he's a secret agent on a mission to rescue the president's daughter, where that's not really the way it is in a lot of the previous games. And I think that tonal shift is something that contributes to it feeling more like an action game, because if you look at the kind of environment that they're in, the area, the ambiance, it feels more like it is horror based. With all the, like we were talking about earlier, the scary woods, the spooky stuff, things like that. Now, you also have, that's another thing, a lot of the areas are designed cool, they're unique. The costumes are really great. I especially like in the assignment Ada stuff, the Separate Ways missions, I mean. It's really interesting to go around as her in the red dress, because it sticks out like a sore thumb, especially in the beginning parts and the end on the boat and in the forest. It really, really does not look like that red dress belongs there. But, that is a thing that exists. So these are some of the more positive aspects of the game. The gameplay itself is very, very fun. The story is really cool. It looks like a great game. The gameplay itself is very fun. Negatives. The first one I think you could point out is probably Ashley. She is very, very annoying. Damsel in distress maybe was taken a little bit too far with her, considering she cannot even climb down ladders by herself, which seems very strange considering she can climb up the ladders by herself. So that seems like maybe was not the best choice. It just makes her very annoying. Also, the shrill "Leon, help, Leon," you get quite often throughout this game. Kind of poopy. So another criticism you hear of this game a lot, and kind of more of a negative thing, is it is moving away from the horror idea. However, I would challenge the fact that Resident Evil was maybe not as scary as a lot of people think it was in the first place. So I didn't grow up with Resident Evil. I played it once I was already kind of older. And I think the thing that people don't realize is when you play this game when you're like a kid, Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, like it's scary, but it's scary because that's kind of all you have. So, like a giant, block monster snake rolls out of the thing and you're like a little kid. Of course, that's kind of scary. You don't want to die in the game. But you get a little bit older, and I think that maybe loses its charm. So I'd make the argument that maybe Resident Evil, those original games, were not as scary as some people feel they were, and maybe that's more nostalgia based than it is actual, because it was terrifying. So you could say that about this game as well, is that maybe it should have had more of a horror tone, because as we discussed earlier, this game was less about surviving. Yes, you get into individual encounters with different enemies, but you don't really you get out of the encounter, but the overarching plot of the story is not to survive, it's to save Ashley. Whereas again, looking at the first game, your whole goal is to survive that mansion, because that is what the people that's what Wesker, who set it up in the first place, has really designed it to be, is for you to attempt to survive through all these, to test these bioweapons, and you have to try and survive through them. So, another negative thing, the game is very, very long, and there is no chapter select available at all. Now, that doesn't really sound like it's a negative, but we're trying to compare it at least a little bit to other types of other Resident Evil titles. Now, previous games don't necessarily have that either, but the thing of it is that they don't really need them as much, and I'll explain why. Because again, using the first game as a great example, the first game takes place mostly in a single location, that being the mansion. Now, the second and third game do expand off that a little bit, but the second game, a lot of the police station, so they don't need it as much. There's a lot of backtracking in those games. Yes, they have some areas like you go outside the mansion, you go under the mansion, but for the most part, if you cut out all the backtracking in those games, like if you just straight up had all the keys you needed and you knew where they went, right off the bat, I think that game would probably be a lot shorter. Whereas Resident Evil 4, it's not like that. It's very linear. You do a mild amount of backtracking in the very beginning of the game, through the town a few times. In the castle, I think you go backwards once. Like you wind up in the same room you started out in one time. But other than that, it's really just a very straightforward path, kind of like it is in Resident Evil 5. But the difference is, 5 has a lot more replayability because you can select the specific area. You don't have to drudge through. Let's say there's one part of a game you really, really hate. For example, I really hate chapter, I believe it's 4-2. It's the one with all the laser pointer puzzles in Resident Evil 5. I hate that chapter. I really don't like that one at all. And I skip it pretty much every time I play through the game. You can't do that with 4. It's not, and that is a criticism I think is fair to make also, because it came out on PS2. A lot of other games I remember having on a PS2 did have chapter select options, so I think that was kind of an oversight maybe by them, which is not a big deal, but it does diminish the replayability of the game, I think, to some degree, because you have to drudge through the entire game or have a billion different saves just to be able to, replay certain parts that you like. It's another thing that you could criticize 4 specifically is it is kind of an awkward transition for Resident Evil as a franchise, because as you can see looking at 5 and 6, they're much more action-based games. They're not really calling those two horror games. If they were not called Resident Evil, I don't know that anyone probably would have denoted them specifically as being horror games. They probably would have gotten more like of an action game title. I think some people really do feel that they're still action games. I definitely do. So 4 is kind of in an awkward stage. It does have that kind of creepy atmosphere. You do have a few parts that are kind of heart-pounding a little bit, but there's not really a focus on trying to make the game really, really scary. But it's also not fully an action game, and the way they blended it together does work really well. But it is kind of the awkward middle child, I guess, if you want to call it that, of the Resident Evil family, looking at the earlier installments, which really are about survival horror. Whether you think they're scary or not is up to you, personal opinion. But they're really about survival horror. 4, not as much. 5 and 6 more action games. So it is kind of the odd one out in that regard. And again, like we talked about earlier, the inventory system depends on if you like it or not. You could view it as a pro, you could view it as a con. I personally like the inventory system, but it's very, very tedious if you do not like the inventory system. You constantly have to organize it, flip the blocks around. It takes forever. So I could definitely see that being a thing that some people would not like about 4. Now, to address a few things that I feel are misconceptions about Resident Evil 4. I feel a few misconceptions people have about this game is it's bad because it's different. Just because something is different does not necessarily mean that it is bad. It definitely does not have the same type of feel as the first 3 games. However, it does have its own feel. It is a cohesive game. You can play it all the way through. It's not like a Billy the Wizard or or something like that, where it is a game that it just doesn't function, or like a CDI Zelda game. I guess Billy the Wizard, not that well known of a game maybe, but like a CDI Zelda game, or like a Superman 64 where the game is just broken. It is a good game in the sense like you play it all the way through. All of the shooting makes sense. It all works. It's a well-made game. They obviously put a lot of thought and effort into the game itself. So I think that a lot of people give some of the later installments a bad rap because it's not what they wanted out of a Resident Evil game, which I think is kind of unfair to those games and to their credit. Now, and I think a lot of that also comes from nostalgia because, you grow up with a game looking or feeling a certain way, and you want it to continue looking or feeling that way, and then when it doesn't, it disappoints you personally, so then it becomes bad. But just because, maybe something is not what you wanted doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Like, I don't feel like the first 3 games are really all that bad of games. They're just not really my own personal preference. Compared to 4 and 5, which are my 2 favorites in the franchise. But anyway, so this is kind of just an off the top of the head review of this game. I know it's an older game, but I was kind of playing the PC version recently on higher graphics because I have kind of a nicer PC now. So that was nice, and it made me want to, kind of give it a review. I guess if I had to give the game a score, just to kind of like sum it up, I'd say it's probably a 7 or an 8 of 10. Trying not to be biased. Like I said, it's one of my favorite games, but I think some people would probably be a lot harsher, maybe give it a lower score, but I think that's partially because a lot of people don't like the later installments just because it's not what they had as a kid. But you can't rate it perfectly either. You can't rate it a 9 or a 10 because it is a game with flaws. Ashley functions very badly on the later difficulties. She gets one shot, she gets in the way all the time. Huge pain in the ass. Again, the replayability is somewhat diminished. I know some people who are really hardcore RE fans, but they still won't play 4 because it's too long. It feels like a really long game. And you just don't have chapter selects or anything like that. So yeah, anyway, that was just kind of a quick review of the game. People like the video. Leave a comment if you want to see like anything else, like if you have an idea for any of the kind of content you want to see or anything like that. Leave a comment, and I will see you guys in the next video.